Morning, Earl. Okay, so why don't we uh, why don't we get started here? Yesterday we saw the tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein about smoking, and that was done in the 80s, just a few years before Rav Moshe passed away, and it became abundantly clear that if you're doing any activity, even on your own property, that is creating a nuisance for a neighbor, uh, then you're obligated, that the neighbor has a right to stop you from doing it. But we haven't yet seen really clear parameters of, how it depends how sensitive the neighbor is. There's something that was in the news a few years ago was people who have a sensitivity to perfume. You know what I'm talking about? Where someone has a hyper sensitivity to cologne and perfume. At what point, let's say a guy walks into the base medrash and is wearing cologne, and there's another fellow who has a hyper. Joby, is there a technical term for that? He has a hypersensitivity to smell, and it disturbs his ability to concentrate and to focus. Can he indeed stop you from wearing your cologne that your wife bought for you for your anniversary, and that you want to show her that you're wearing? Okay, and what if it's just deodorant and it's not a cologne, and it's a very faint uh, trace of odor, of fragrance, and he's still sensitive? So at what point do we say that the needs of the hypersensitive individual outweigh all other considerations? So we haven't for sure.
I thought in that last case, the alternative may be worse.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so some businesses, they've made fragrance free for that reason. Yeah.
In fact,
Okay.
I was on a work from home kind of seminar, and they were talking about, one person said they're happy to work from home because they can finally wear their perfume. So
Interesting.
I guess there are some side and weird benefits from COVID. You trip over them every now and then.
Okay. All right. So I do want to get to that point. We will see some more parameters being crystallized along the way. But before we saw Rav Moshe's tshuva 2 days ago, we were in the middle of this Imrei Yaakov, where he was talking about the damage of Aish, where something begins on your property, spreads over to another property based on no effort of your own, but as a result causes damage on another person's property. We were in the middle of this paragraph Pei Vav, Sifkat and Pei Vav. It's about 5 lines down in Pei Vav, and he writes, "Hasholeach es habe'ira biyad cheresh shoyte v'katan, pater midine adam v'chayev b'dine shamayim." That if you give a pan that has a hot coal in it, and you give it to a person who is mentally incapacitated, this person may be a child, or it may be someone who's mentally disabled, and they go ahead and they treat it recklessly, but as they would be expected to do because they don't have the mental capacity to guard it responsibly, then the Gemara says that we cannot hold you liable in a mortal court, but Hashem will hold you liable in a heavenly court, just like we've seen by so many aspects of damage, where if it's indirect, you cannot be held liable. But bamed dvarim amurim kishemasar lahem gachelet v'libuha shederech hagachelet lehichavot me'eleha. And that's only true if you gave someone a hot coal, this person who's mentally incapacitated, you gave them a hot coal, and then that person went ahead and fanned the flame and increased the flame of the coal to make it into something harmful. Because normally a coal extinguishes on its own over the course of time. But if you give the chereshoita v'katan an active flame, so that it's actively emitting flame, so then you can be held liable even in a mortal beis din, because it's your action that is causing a more direct form of damage. You're sending out fire with, just like if you would send out fire on a kite and it would go ahead and cause damage, you'd be liable. So too, if you send out an irresponsible child and have the child walk around with it, then you're causing the damage. Similarly, let's say if you took an animal and you ignited something on the back of the animal, and it went around, walking around different places where an animal is expected to walk, you would be chayav. Akofef kamato shel chaveru lifnei hadleika, kidei shetagia ba hadleika. Now, another type of causative act. Let's say you bend over a stalk from your neighbor's field and insert it into an adjacent flame, so that the flame will ignite the stalk. In kafafa b'makom shetuchal hadaleka lahagia beruach mitzuya chayav l'shalem. Even if you didn't insert the bent over stalk directly into the flame, but you just bent it over so that when a wind would blow, the fire would reach the bent over stalk, so then you're going to be liable. But v'im eina yachola lahagia beruach mitzuya pater midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. But if you bent it over in such a way that it's near the fire, but not near enough, that a common wind would cause the fire to reach the stalk, but an uncommon wind would. So there again, you're going to be pater midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. You're going to be exempt from a mortal court, but you'll be liable in a heavenly court, because you're doing something, you're playing chicken with someone else's property, or Russian roulette, or whatever the case may be. Kaimalan the tamun be'esh pater. He's really just giving us a review of all of the different things that the Gemara says about the damage of the category of Eish, which is helpful, I suppose, for this discussion, because it sort of allows us to apply some of these issues. The Gemara also says that if something is covered and fire, let's say, travels from my property to your property, but the item in question that got damaged was covered, it was concealed and not visible, so then I, as the originator of the fire, will be exempt from any damaged item that was covered at the time when my fire traveled. And how do we know this? He says, because the Beparshas Mishpat in Ksiv, Ki seitze eish umatza'a kotzim v'ne'echal gadish o hakama o hasadeh. Because if you look at the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim, it says, when fire will go out and it finds thorns, and as a result, the growing crops are damaged by fire, Shalem yeshalem hamaviris habe'era, then the person causing the fire shall surely pay. V'darshinan shahadavar hanisraf bo'inan sheyehidumya dekama v'gadish shehin dvarim shebagalui. And the Gemara derives from the language of the pasuk that the item that is damaged has to be out in the open. But if it's covered up or concealed, and it's not like the stalks of a field that's out in the open, so then I'm going to be exempt. Lafukim nitman bahem davar. Va'ayin sham b'shulchan aruch kama pratim bazeh. The Shulchan Aruch expands on this issue and discusses different circumstances. Va'ayin chazonish, and the chazonish now tries to apply this to real life situations. He says, "The mistapek ihabayis osem asher b'socho litamun." He says, what if my fire travels onto my neighbor's property and burns down his house, God forbid? Can I argue that everything that's inside the house is concealed because it's not out in the open, it's not open to the air? The efshir dekevin da habayis asui leknisa betocha habalei masha betocha galoi. He says, but on the other hand, since people walk into the house regularly, everything in the house is exposed to those who go into it. And he says, umasik decheni kar, and that's his conclusion, that a person will be liable for fire damage to a neighbor's property if he's treating fire in a hazardous way on his own property, such that it easily travels with a common wind, sparks fly over with a common wind to his neighbor's property. I guess like if you're playing with fireworks, something like that in your backyard, and it's very easy for things to ignite from things like that. So then you're going, or you make a bonfire, and it gets out of control. You're going to be liable. The ayin lakam and simin tes if tezvav divrei maschil batlo de laharbe poskim gam bizman hazed de leka dayonim smuchim mikol makam lo batlu dinei eish. As we're going to explain in a later chapter, nowadays, even though our bate din are limited in what they can assess as far as damages, the laws of fire are still quite extant. And if you were to take someone to Beis Din, the Beis Din could hold you liable for a full litany of damages through the damage of Eish. Reuven shenosa im Shimon ba'agala tu'unat semer gefen. So let's say Reuven and Shimon are traveling in a wagon or in a carriage or in any kind of transport, and that transport contains a flammable material. He gives the example of cotton, but it could be any flammable material. The Shimon Ishain Sigaria, the Garam Sheisaref Hatzemer Gefen, and Shimon smokes a cigarette, causing the flammable material to ignite. He says, Ayin Shut Shvus Yaakov Chelak Alat Simin Kuf Lamed Vav. He says that is in itself a separate shaila. I mean, imagine you're on the Hindenburg, and they have rules about smoking, and you pull out a cigarette and say, that doesn't apply to me, and you start smoking, and then all of a sudden everything blows up, right? So that's the kind of situation that we're talking about. Obviously, there are certain environments where you're not allowed to produce anything that's flammable because it could create tremendous damage. Okay, I don't think we're going to look at
Smoking
that.
Smoking a cigarette while filling up your car.
Smoking a cigarette while filling up your car. Not a very smart thing to do. No. All right. Okay. Oh, okay. Now we're going to get into this issue of how sensitive the other party is, because one of the things that we had seen in the Rav Shulchan Aruch is Vim yesh lishcheno choli harosh, that if your neighbor has a headache, like a migraine, and umazik lo kol haka'a, and to the point where making banging noises creates a problem for him. Lo yichtosh rifot v'chayotze b'hem midvarim shekol haka'asa magila beishcheno umazik. You're not allowed to be doing activity like crushing grain, like certain types of machinery that have a banging noise. Since you're not allowed to do that on your property, if you know it's going to cause discomfort and some level of suffering to your neighbor. So,
Rabbi, because you brought it up the other day with the thing about the leaf blowers. That's starting to. I'm starting to see a little press about that because it's starting to bother a lot of people. That it's really causing them distress hearing that noise from those leaf blowers.
I have to tell you, somebody's got to invent a silent leaf blower. Did I say that already? Oh yeah? Okay, Mordechai, this is your next business. You got to import them from Mexico? Okay.
We really want you to repeat that, Rabbi, given the chuckle.
Mordechai was saying that there are silent leaf blowers that operate on electricity. And I told him that should be his next business, because I know that Mordechai's an entrepreneur. All right.
But I mean, is there any thought about either the time of day that this happens, or just, neighbors are building their driveways out and it's making a huge noise, but it has to be done, and it's being done in the middle of the day. It's only going to last until it's done how could they be restricted from doing that?
Exactly. So again, you're also, I mean, that's another consideration is how long-term is the noise? Can a neighbor complain if it's just a 1 day or 2 day or even 10-day activity because he needs the neighbor's doing renovation in his house? I mean, how, or, how long of a time span are we talking about?
And is it being done like at noon, or is it being done at, oh, sorry, I didn't realize someone's speaking.
But Mordechai was also asking, what about a barking dog? Does a neighbor have a right to protest the noise that's made by a dog? It's a good question. This is something that we have to look into.
Yeah, we had a neighbor who puts his dog out about 11 p.m. and actually his telling the dog to shut up is more disturbing than the dog barking. But that happens quite occasionally. And what are you supposed to do? Like, you don't really want to complain to a neighbor, but it's disturbing.
Yeah, the neighbor may not even be aware of the nuisance. Sometimes it's probably a good thing to let the neighbor know in a very friendly way that he is creating a nuisance in the neighborhood. Okay, let's continue. There's a lot more for us to see. So Choli Harosh. So he says because of Harivash Simon Kuf Tzarivav, the Rivash, who's an early Acharon, writes that Duhu Hadin Chalush Hamezeg O Kaptan, that it's not just the person who claims he's getting migraines, a person who is a very weak or sensitive constitution, or he just has a temper, or he's just very, very sensitive. Even though other people, this noise doesn't bother them. But if this person who's your neighbor is very sensitive, very fastidious, and you know that he can't tolerate it, it drives him nuts. So you also have to desist from this activity. But again, like we said, what's the limit? At what point, do you say that his demands are unreasonable? Kasav hachazanish she'im umnaso bepatish orechaim v'achar kach ira choila b'shcheno. He says, if a person that lives next door to you, his business that he does from home is to work with a hammer or with a mill. These are noisy instruments. And then the neighbor next door who's been tolerating this for years gets sick. And as a result of his sickness, the doctors say you can't afford to hear any loud noises. He says that in that kind of scenario, the neighbor cannot compel his next door neighbor to stop the noise. He says in a situation where there's a long-standing precedent that the guy's been allowed to make this noise, you cannot stop him because you've developed a new condition. You may have to move, or you may have to go away for a while until your condition improves. But if it's a new condition that develops within you, and this guy's been doing this for a long time, that's when you cannot compel him. But it's only in a situation where the guy wants to start a new business in his backyard or a new activity in his backyard, which involves loud noises. One of the issues is like in the certain times of the month, a guy may want to sit in his backyard and blast his ghetto blaster, his loud stereo. And he wants to listen to, the top 40 or the latest music or whatever it is, or he's a hip hop guy and he wants to listen to graphically explicit lyrics, and it's just, this is not something that you should be forced to have to tolerate.
So you can rap him over the knuckles then, if it's rap music. Too early in the morning, Rabbi?
Yeah, I think so. I think any time is too early. that one. Okay. Anyway, aval hanesivos hamishpat kasav dafilo hayabari v'achar kach nechel elo mahani chazak. But the nesivos hamishpat, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, he writes that even if the guy was healthy, and the neighbor has this precedent of making noises in his work. If the neighbor does get sick, then you cannot say my precedent overrides your illness. He completely disagrees with the Chazon Ish. Dechole havidino kekutra ubeis hakise de lo moil bahem chazaka. He says, because once a person falls ill, it's like then the neighbor has the status of a nuisance maker, even if the neighbor had previously been able to tolerate the noise. Because once you cause a person to become disturbed or to become compromised in their health because of the noise that you're making, then it's like you've started emanating smoke or bad odor from an outhouse, and the neighbor can no longer tolerate it. So you have a fundamental machlokes between a major poskim. The Chazon Ish, of course, is 20th century, so he's much later than the Nesivos HaMishpat. But this is the dispute. The dispute is that does precedent work? Does chazaka work in a case of a neighbor who has already had this established precedent of making all this noise? Can a guy say, all right, 5 years later, I've developed a condition, whether physical or psychological, that prevents me from hearing loud noises? Does that work? So this is the machlokas. So let's go on to the rest of the Imrei Yaakov over here. Od Kasav Shama Chazon Ish, he says the Chazon Ish further writes, Ve'ein din ze amar ela ba'osa davar she'eno ikar dira, kemo ariga v'chayotze bo she'ein ze matzui barov b'nei adam. Now here's another parameter which is very, very important. Chazon Ish writes, he says that the only time that you can stop a neighbor from their activity is when they're engaged in an activity that is not a primary staple of a person's household activity, right? Such as, let's say, a person is engaged in weaving, right? Or some other kind of uncommon activity that people would do in their home. That's where you could say the noise that you're making from the loom or from whatever machinery you're using is creating a nuisance for me. But if this person is doing an activity that most people do in the course of taking care of their home, and at certain times, their activity or their speech is disturbing to the sick person who lives next door, then they cannot protest even if the sick person was there first. I remember in my in-laws' home in Los Angeles, they used to have a neighbor many years ago. My wife and I were just reminiscing about it because we went to visit my in-laws. They had a neighbor in LA. Quite often the windows are open because of the mild climate. And the neighbor would often shout, "Shut up!" And we were just having a regular conversation in the kitchen breakfast room, with not speaking loudly, but they were very sensitive to noise, and apparently their window was right opposite the kitchen window, okay, the window where they were engaged in their activity. So they could hear just regular sound of conversation. And my in-laws are very, very kind and gentle people, and they didn't want to create controversy. But I remember many years ago as a young man, I probably shouldn't have done this, but I said, "You shut up." And I yelled back at them. So the point that the Chazon Ish is making is that if it's regular activity that most people engage in, like operating a vacuum, or to clean your carpets, or to operate a washing machine that's making the standard noise that a washing machine makes. or maybe even hiring a landscaper to do leaf blowing. And that's something that's the accepted standard in the neighborhood. So that's where a neighbor does not have a right to protest. It's only when you're doing something exceptional that is not being done by most of the neighbors, that's where the guy has a right to protest. And so that gives us an additional sort of crystallization of this halacha. I think what I'd like to do is take a look at this Chazon Ish next time. Let me just make sure I have the source here, but I'll take a look at it later. I just want to finish one last piece from the Imrei Yaakov, and then next week we have to look at the Chazon Ish, and next week we also want to look at the Biurim to discuss a person who's operating an air conditioner. And an air conditioner, is that something that a neighbor can say, your air conditioning unit is making too much noise? Kol ha'haka'a, he says, if your neighbor is disturbed by the banging sound of the apparatus in your backyard, he can stop you. He says, V'im to'ein shera'ash hamizgain or hamazgan mafrielo ayin biur. He says, if your neighbor complains that the sound of the air conditioner is bothering him, that's what I undertake in this very long essay in my biurim. What we're going to do is we're going to just start that biurim, and then we'll jump to the conclusions at the very end of that of this very long essay, and then we'll get to the bottom line. And that's going to be very helpful to us to create parameters in this type of halacha. But the two things that we just saw most recently is that there's a major machlokas in regard to if you can create a precedent of noise making or not. That's one machlokas. And then the next thing that we saw from the Chazon Ish, which is very important, is if the sound of the noise that's coming from your property is conventional, it's something that every household typically does in order to just maintain household chores, like the operation of appliances, in your home to keep the house clean and tidy. So then that's not something that a neighbor has a right to protest over, even if they're hypersensitive to noise. Right? Okay. So I think we're going to hold it here for today. Any questions, comments? Right. So Mordechai is asking the question, what about the timing? What if it's midnight and I want to operate my vacuum? I want to vacuum my carpets at midnight or 3 a.m. Is that grounds? That sounds like a reasonable thing because most people typically do their household chores during the day. That sounds like an exceptional activity, and perhaps there would be grounds for it. So that's another factor that we have to look into. What are the hours of operation that are acceptable? We haven't seen any parameters yet, but I hopefully will get some clarifications soon. Yes, right, sure. We know that because there's less background noise during the nighttime, of course. Okay. The atmosphere. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.